They knocked on my door at 7 in the morning, 3 days after my grandfather's funeral. Two men in polo shirts with Copper Ridge Estates security logos handed me a $3,000 citation for my rental truck parked overnight in my own driveway. I'd flown in from Portland to bury the man who raised me. I hadn't slept in 40 hours. And these two strangers were telling me I'd violated community parking standards on property my family has owned since before their subdivision existed. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. The taller one smirked when I asked to see the regulation. Ma'am, the HOA board doesn't appreciate newcomers who don't understand how things work here. He didn't know I was an environmental lawyer. He didn't know my grandfather left me more than just this house, and he certainly didn't know what was coming. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 35 years old, and until last week, I hadn't set foot in Arizona in 15 years. I left after college, chasing a career in environmental law that took me to Portland, then Seattle, then back to Portland again. My grandfather, Henry, understood. He'd always told me to build my own life, not inherit his, but he also made me promise to come back when it mattered. When he called 3 weeks ago to say the cancer had spread and there was nothing left to do, I booked the first flight home. I held his hand in the hospice for 6 days. I buried him in the family plot beside my grandmother, and now I was standing in his kitchen, holding a citation from people who had no idea whose land they were standing on. The house sits on a small rise at the western edge of what used to be Whitfield Ranch, 80 acres my great-grandfather claimed in 1922. From the front porch, I could see the subdivision stretching east toward the mountains, 450 identical homes with terracotta roofs and xeriscaped yards, arranged in neat curving streets with names like Sunset Vista and Desert Bloom Lane. Copper Ridge Estates, built in the late 80s, expanded in the 90s, now home to nearly 1,200 people who probably thought they owned the ground beneath their feet. I hadn't thought much about it growing up. It was just the neighborhood next door. But standing there that morning, watching the security SUV drive back toward the subdivision entrance, I started to wonder what exactly my grandfather had left me. The phone call came 2 hours later. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Constance Blackwell, president of the Copper Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Her tone was warm in the way that expensive customer service is warm, practiced, professional, and completely insincere. Ms. Whitfield, I wanted to personally extend my condolences on your grandfather's passing. Henry was a fixture in this area for many years. She paused, and I could hear the shift in her voice. I also wanted to discuss the future of your property. The board has received several concerns from residents about the condition of the house and its impact on neighborhood aesthetics. We'd like to offer you a fair price for a quick sale, something that would allow you to return to your life in Oregon without the burden of managing a property so far from home. I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the rows of identical houses. I appreciate the call, Mrs. Blackwell, but I'm not interested in selling. The warmth evaporated instantly. I see. Well, I should mention that properties adjacent to our community are subject to certain, expectations. Your grandfather understood that. He kept a low profile, maintained his property to acceptable standards, and we coexisted peacefully for decades. I hope you'll choose to do the same. I asked her what would happen if I didn't. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. Life in this area can become very difficult for people who don't cooperate with the community. Ms. Whitfield, I'm sure you understand. She hung up without saying goodbye. I spent the rest of that day cleaning, sorting through my grandfather's things, boxing up clothes for donation, trying to impose order on the chaos of grief. It wasn't until evening, when the desert sky turned orange and purple outside the window, that I finally opened the filing cabinet in his study. My grandfather had been meticulous about records, 40 years of tax documents, property assessments, water rights certificates, all organized in labeled folders with his careful handwriting. But 3 folders in the bottom drawer caught my attention. The first was labeled Copper Ridge Ground Lease. The second, Land Records Whitfield Family Trust. The third, thicker than the others, Payments Received. I pulled them out and spread them across the desk. The ground lease was dated 1985, a 50-year agreement between Henry Whitfield and Copper Ridge Development LLC for the use of approximately 1,000 acres of Whitfield land. The developer would build homes, roads, and community facilities. In exchange, they would pay my grandfather $150,000 per year, adjusted for inflation, for the duration of the lease. When the developer went bankrupt in 2005, the lease obligations transferred to the Homeowners Association. The payments had continued every year since. $150,000, deposited into a trust account I'd never known existed. I turned to the map hanging on the wall behind the desk, a survey map I'd seen 1,000 times growing up, but never really examined. The boundary lines were clear. Whitfield land extended from the western hills to the county road, from the dry wash in the north to the old highway in the south. 1,000 acres. And Copper Ridge Estates, every house, every street, every inch of that manicured subdivision sat entirely within those boundaries. My hands were shaking as I turned back to the lease agreement. 50 years, signed in 1985. That meant it would expire in 2035, 10 years from now. And buried in Section 12, highlighted in yellow by my grandfather's hand, was a clause I had to read 3 times before I understood in the event of material breach by tenant, including but not limited to failure to maintain property standards, unauthorized construction, or interference with landlord's adjacent property rights. Landlord may terminate this agreement with 90 days written notice. I sat back in my grandfather's chair, staring at the subdivision lights twinkling in the darkness outside. Constance Blackwell had threatened to make my life difficult. She had no idea that I now owned every inch of ground beneath her feet, and that her harassment had just given me grounds to take it all back. I met Dolores Vega the next morning at the mailbox. She lived in a small adobe house half a mile down the county road, one of the few original properties that predated the subdivision, like my grandfather's. She was 72 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that had seen enough to fill several lifetimes. She'd known my grandfather for 40 years. She'd watched Copper Ridge Estates rise from desert scrub into the sprawling community it was today. And she had stories that made my blood run cold. They came after me first in 2012, she said, pouring coffee in her kitchen while morning light slanted through the windows. Citations for my fence being 2 inches too tall, complaints about my wind chimes disturbing the peace, letters saying my house was an eyesore that damaged property values. She set the cup in front of me with a steady hand. My husband had just passed. I was alone, grieving, trying to figure out how to survive on a fixed income. And Constance Blackwell showed up at my door with a generous offer to buy my property 40% below market value. She said it was the best I could hope for, given the issues with my home. I asked her what happened. Dolores smiled thin, hard, triumphant. I told her to go to hell in Spanish, so she'd have to look it up. The smile faded. But not everyone was as stubborn as me. I've watched 12 families leave this road in the past 5 years. Nora, 12, the Hendersons, the Nakamuras, the old widow Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived here since 1978. All of them got the same treatment citations, complaints, pressure, and isolation. All of them eventually sold. And you know who bought most of those properties? I shook my head. Blackwell Properties LLC, registered to Warren Blackwell Constance's husband. 8 of those 12 homes are now rental properties, generating income for the Blackwells. They've turned harassment into a business model. The pattern was systematic. Dolores had kept records not as meticulously as my grandfather, but enough to show the timeline. A family would receive their first citation within weeks of refusing some request from the HOA board. Then the complaints would start anonymous reports about noise, appearance, and parking violations. Community emails would circulate expressing concern about the property. Neighbors who had been friendly for years would suddenly stop waving, stop talking, stop acknowledging the target existed. Within 6 to 18 months, the family would sell, usually to Warren Blackwell's LLC, always below market value. The HOA would issue a statement thanking the departing residents for their years of contribution to the community, and the cycle would begin again with someone new. But your grandfather, Dolores said, refilling my coffee, they never touched Henry, not once in all these years. I always wondered why. She looked at me with curiosity that bordered on suspicion. He never told me, and I never asked. But there was something about the way Constance looked at him, like she was afraid of something, like He knew something she didn't want anyone else to know. I thought about the folders in my grandfather's filing cabinet, the ground lease, the payment records. The map shows Whitfield land encompassing the entire subdivision. Dolores, did you know the HOA pays rent for the land Copper Ridge sits on? She set down her coffee cup slowly. What do you mean, rent? I explained what I'd found: the 50-year ground lease, the annual payments, the fact that homeowners in the subdivision didn't actually own the ground beneath their houses. They owned the structures, the improvements, and the right to use the land for the duration of the lease. But the land itself had always belonged to my family. Dolores stared at me for a long moment. $150,000 a year, she repeated. For how long? I told her since 1985. She did the math in her head, her eyes widening. That's millions of dollars, and the residents don't know. I shook my head. The lease was between my grandfather and the original developer. When the developer went bankrupt, the HOA took over the payments. But there's no indication they ever disclosed the arrangement to homeowners. People bought houses thinking they owned the property outright. They've been paying mortgages, property taxes, HOA fees, and none of them know they're essentially renting the land from my family. Dolores was quiet for a long time. Through the window, I could see the subdivision in the distance, rows of terracotta roofs stretching toward the mountains. Nearly 500 families living their lives without any idea of the truth beneath their feet. 450 families, she finally said. 1,200 people, and Constance has been lying to all of them. She looked at me with something new in her eyes, not just curiosity now, but hope. What are you going to do? I didn't have an answer yet. The night before, I'd read through the entire lease agreement 3 times, making notes, highlighting clauses, trying to understand the full scope of what my grandfather had left me. The termination provisions were clear material breach by the tenant, including interference with the landlord's property rights, could end the lease with 90 days' notice. Everything the HOA had built would revert to the landowner. Everything. The homes, the roads, the community center, the parks. In theory, I could evict 1,200 people from the only homes they'd ever known. But that wasn't what I wanted. Those families hadn't done anything wrong. They were victims of Constance Blackwell's deception, just as much as Dolores. Just as much as the 12 families who'd been driven out over the years. The question wasn't whether I had power. I did, more than Constance could imagine. The question was how to use it, how to hold the people responsible accountable without destroying the lives of hundreds of innocent families caught in the middle. I don't know yet, I told Dolores honestly, but I'm going to find out exactly what Constance has been doing with that money, and exactly how many rules she's broken. And then I'm going to make sure everyone in that subdivision knows the truth. Dolores reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said you were the one who would set things right. I hadn't known he'd said that. I hadn't known a lot of things about Henry Whitfield, apparently, but I was learning. And what I learned next would determine whether Copper Ridge Estates had a future or whether Constance Blackwell had already destroyed it. Chad Cooper's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix, with windows overlooking the sprawl of the valley below. He was 48 years old, built like a former college athlete who'd traded the gym for a desk but hadn't completely given up. And he had spent the past 2 decades specializing in Arizona real estate law. I'd found him through a referral from a colleague in Portland, someone who had worked with him on a complex land trust case, and described him as the guy you call when property rights get weird. My situation definitely qualified. He'd asked me to bring everything: the ground lease, the payment records, the survey maps, and any other documentation my grandfather had kept. I arrived with 2 banker's boxes and spent the first hour watching him read while the city shimmered in the afternoon heat outside. When he finally set down the last document, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. Ms. Whitfield, do you understand what you're holding here? I told him I was beginning to. He shook his head. I've been practicing real estate law for 23 years. I've seen ground leases for shopping centers, for apartment complexes, for commercial developments, but I've never seen one for an entire master planned community that the residents apparently don't know exists. Chad explained the legal framework in terms I could follow, even though I'd already started piecing it together myself. Ground leases were common in Arizona, a legacy of the state's history with railroad land grants. tribal territories, and large family holdings. A landowner would lease property to a developer for a fixed term, typically 30 to 99 years. The developer would build whatever they wanted: homes, businesses, infrastructure, and sell or rent those improvements to end users. But the land itself never changed hands. When the lease expired, everything built on that land reverted to the original owner or their heirs. It's called the doctrine of accession, Chad said. Whatever is affixed to the land becomes part of the land. When the lease ends, the landowner gets it all: buildings, roads, utilities, everything. I asked about the homeowners. Didn't they have rights? Chad pulled up a file on his computer, the standard purchase agreement used by the original developer. Buyers were purchasing leasehold interest, not fee-simple ownership. The disclosure should have been on page 47 of their contracts, buried in a section about land tenure. Most people don't read that far. Most real estate agents don't explain it. And based on what you've told me about the HOA's behavior, I doubt they've been advertising the fact that their entire community sits on borrowed ground. He scrolled through the document. The residents own their homes, the physical structures. They can sell, renovate, or pass them to heirs, but the land underneath operates on a completely different clock, and that clock runs out in 10 years. The violations were what interested me most. I'd highlighted several sections of the lease that seemed problematic based on what Dolores had told me and what I'd observed during my first days back in Arizona. Chad reviewed each one methodically. Section 4.2 prohibited construction beyond the boundaries specified in the original development plan, but satellite imagery showed the community center had been expanded twice since 2010, pushing into areas that weren't part of the approved footprint. Section 6.1 required the tenant to notify the landlord of any changes in management or governance structure, but the HOA had never once contacted my grandfather since taking over the lease in 2005. Section 8.3 prohibited commercial use of community facilities, but Dolores had mentioned the clubhouse was regularly rented out for weddings, corporate events, and private parties, with revenue going directly to HOA operating funds. Any one of these could be argued as a material breach, Chad said, making notes on a legal pad. Combined, they represent a pattern of non-compliance that's been ongoing for years. Your grandfather would have been within his rights to terminate the lease at any point. The question is why he didn't. I thought about Henry Whitfield, the quiet rancher who'd watched a subdivision grow up around his land, who had collected payments every year without complaint, who had kept meticulous records but never acted on the violations he must have known were occurring. I think he was waiting, I said slowly. Waiting for what? I looked out the window at the city below, for someone who would know what to do with it. Chad outlined my options with the careful precision of someone who had seen clients make costly mistakes by moving too fast. Option 1, I could terminate the lease immediately based on documented violations. Within 90 days, the HOA would be required to vacate, and all improvements would revert to me as the landowner. It was legally sound, but practically devastating. 1,200 people would lose their homes, and I'd face years of litigation from residents who'd argue they were misled by the original developer and the HOA. Option 2, I could renegotiate the lease with more favorable terms, using the threat of termination as leverage: higher payments, stricter oversight, and guaranteed transparency with residents. It was the diplomatic approach, but it assumed Constance Blackwell would negotiate in good faith, an assumption I wasn't prepared to make. Option 3, I could do nothing. Let the lease run its course, collect my payments, and wait for 2035 to deal with the consequences. It was the path of least resistance, but it meant allowing the harassment to continue, allowing the Blackwells to keep exploiting their position, allowing hundreds of families to remain ignorant of the truth about their homes. None of those options felt right. I wanted accountability for what Constance had done to me, to Dolores, to the 12 families who'd been driven out over the years. But I didn't want to punish innocent people for the crimes of their HOA leadership. I needed a fourth option. What if I don't terminate the lease? I said, thinking out loud. But I make it impossible for them to keep the violations hidden. What if I force transparency? Chad raised an eyebrow. How would you do that? I explained what I was thinking: document every violation, build a complete record of the Blackwells' misconduct, and then present it all to the community at once. Let the residents see what their leadership had been hiding. Let them decide whether they wanted to keep paying fees to people who'd been lying to them for 2 decades. Force an internal reckoning before pursuing external legal action. Chad was quiet for a moment, tapping his pen against the legal pad. That's risky. You'd be exposing yourself to retaliation before you've secured your legal position. Constance Blackwell doesn't strike me as the type to go quietly. I thought about the citation on my first morning, the threatening phone call, the smirk on the security guard's face when he told me I didn't understand how things worked. She's already retaliating, I said. The difference is, right now she thinks I'm just an annoyance. She has no idea what I'm actually holding. I gathered the documents back into my boxes. Let her keep underestimating me. Let her keep making mistakes. By the time she realizes what's happening, I'll have everything I need to bring her down. Chad stood and shook my hand. I'll start preparing the documentation package, certified copies of the lease, survey comparisons showing the unauthorized construction, financial analysis of the commercial revenue from the clubhouse. When you're ready to move, you'll have everything organized and bulletproof. I thanked him and headed for the elevator. The sun was setting over Phoenix as I drove back toward Copper Ridge, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red. Constance Blackwell thought she was dealing with a grieving woman who had inherited a rundown house. She thought a few citations and veiled threats would be enough to make me sell and disappear. She had no idea I was just getting started. The first email blast went out 4 days after I met with Chad. I know, because Dolores forwarded it to me within minutes of receiving it. Her message containing only 2 words, "It's starting." The subject line read, "Concerning Neighbor Activity Community Alert." The body was 3 paragraphs of carefully crafted innuendo. It didn't mention me by name that would have been too obvious, too actionable. Instead, it referenced a recently arrived individual on adjacent property whose disregard for community standards and confrontational attitude toward board leadership had raised serious concerns about the safety and property values of our neighborhood. The email encouraged residents to remain vigilant and to report any suspicious activity to HOA security. It was signed by the Community Standards Committee, but I recognized the syntax, the rhythm, the particular brand of passive-aggressive threat-making. Constance Blackwell had written every word. The citations escalated from annoying to absurd. In the span of 2 weeks, I received 7 separate violation notices. My fence paint was inconsistent with approved community color palettes, even though my property wasn't part of the community. My excessive vegetation was creating pest-harboring conditions, even though the mesquite trees in question had stood for 60 years. My truck was cited 3 more times for overnight parking violations that apparently applied to vehicles visible from subdivision streets, regardless of whose property they were parked on. Each citation carried a fine ranging from $500 to $2,000. The total exceeded $8,000 before the month was over. I filed every single one in the folder I'd labeled evidence of harassment and kept detailed photographs with timestamps. The community forum posts were harder to track but impossible to ignore. Dolores had a neighbor in the subdivision, Elena Martinez, a young mother who'd grown suspicious of the HOA board after being fined for her children's sidewalk chalk drawings, who sent screenshots of the private online forum where residents discussed community matters. Anonymous accounts had begun posting about the problem property on the western boundary. The tone ranged from concerned to openly hostile. One post suggested I was probably running some kind of illegal operation based on the number of times my truck had been cited. Another speculated that I was deliberately trying to lower property values to force people out. A third called for the board to take whatever legal action necessary to protect our community from this threat. The posts accumulated likes and supportive comments. The few residents who asked for evidence or suggested giving me the benefit of the doubt were quickly shouted down. Warren Blackwell appeared at my gate on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a white Mercedes SUV that looked freshly washed, despite the desert dust that coated everything else. He was 65 years old, tall and lean with silver hair and the practiced smile of a man who had spent decades closing deals. He didn't introduce himself. He assumed I already knew who he was. "Ms. Whitfield, I think we got off on the wrong foot. My wife can be passionate about community standards, but I'm a businessman, and I prefer to solve problems with solutions that benefit everyone." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. I'm prepared to offer you $420,000 for your property, all cash, closing within 30 days. That's a fair price for a house in this condition, and it saves you the headache of dealing with all these citations and complaints." I didn't take the envelope. I asked him what he thought my grandfather's property was actually worth. Warren's smile flickered. "The market determines value, Ms. Whitfield, and right now, a property with this many compliance issues, surrounded by a community that views it as a nuisance well, the market isn't favorable." I told him the house had been appraised at $750,000 2 years ago. When my grandfather updated his estate plan, I told him $420,000 was 44% below that value. And I told him I wasn't interested in selling to someone who'd made a career out of pressuring vulnerable people into accepting lowball offers for their homes. Warren's smile disappeared entirely. "You're making a mistake. Constance doesn't lose. She has friends on the county planning commission, on the zoning board, in places you can't even imagine. By the time she's done, that house won't be worth the land it's—" He stopped himself, but I'd already heard enough. The land it's sitting on. He knew. Of course, he knew. He and Constance had been paying my family for that land for 20 years. That evening, I called Chad and asked him to prepare an official notice documenting the lease violations. Not to send yet, just to have ready. He told me the documentation package was almost complete satellite imagery showing the unauthorized community center expansion, financial records obtained through public information requests showing revenue from clubhouse rentals, a timeline of HOA governance changes that had never been reported to the landowner. "When you're ready to move," he said, "one letter from my office will put them on notice that every violation has been cataloged and preserved. They'll have 90 days to cure the breaches or face termination proceedings." I asked him to hold off a little longer. I wanted to see how far Constance would push before I pushed back. I didn't have to wait long. The emergency meeting notice arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered by Martinez and another security guard who didn't bother hiding his smirk. The agenda was a single item. Vote to authorize legal action against non-compliant adjacent property owner for damages to community property values. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the community center, the same building that had been illegally expanded onto land that wasn't part of the original lease. The irony was almost too perfect. Dolores called me that night, her voice tight with worry. "They're going to try to bury you. Nora, I've seen this before. They'll pack the room with loyalists, control the narrative, and make you look like the villain. By the time you get a chance to speak, everyone will already have decided you're the enemy." I told her I understood the playbook. I told her I'd seen it used before in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in every setting where people with power tried to silence people who threatened that power. But I also told her something I hadn't told anyone else yet. I told her what my grandfather had left me. I told her about the ground lease, about the violations, about the leverage I'd been quietly assembling while Constance thought she was winning. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted a long time. When Dolores finally spoke, her voice was different, not worried anymore, but something closer to wonder. "You own the land, all of it, every house, every street, the community center where they're going to hold this meeting." I confirmed it. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that held 15 years of frustration and hope in equal measure. "They have no idea. Do they? Constance thinks she's about to destroy you, and she doesn't know she's standing on your property while she does it." I told her that was exactly right. And I told her that on Saturday, everyone in that room was going to learn the truth. The next 3 days were the calmest I'd felt since arriving in Arizona. I knew what was coming. I knew what I had. And for the first time since my grandfather's funeral, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Constance Blackwell wanted a war. She was about to discover she'd been fighting on enemy territory the entire time. The community center parking lot was nearly full when I arrived on Saturday afternoon. Over 70 vehicles were arranged in neat rows on asphalt that extended well beyond the boundaries my grandfather's survey maps had specified. I parked on the street outside the subdivision entrance and walked in, carrying a laptop bag and the folder of documents Chad had helped me organize. The desert sun was brutal, over 100 degrees even in the shade, but I barely noticed. My focus was entirely on what was about to happen inside. The main hall had been arranged with rows of folding chairs facing a raised platform where the board sat behind a long table. Constance Blackwell occupied the center position, flanked by 4 other board members. Warren sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching the door. When he saw me enter, something flickered across his face. Surprise, then calculation, then a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned over to whisper something to the woman beside him. I signed in at the registration table, took a seat near the back, and waited. Constance called the meeting to order at exactly 2 o'clock. She moved through preliminary business efficiently before arriving at the main agenda item. As many of you know, our community has been facing an ongoing challenge from an adjacent property owner whose disregard for standards and hostile attitude toward this board has created significant concerns. She paused, letting her gaze land on me. Today, we're asking for your authorization to pursue legal action. The board recommends a special assessment of $200 per household to fund this effort. The murmurs that rippled through the audience were mostly supportive, heads nodding, people exchanging glances of agreement. Constance had spent weeks preparing this moment: the email campaign, the forum posts, the narrative of an outsider threatening their peaceful community. Most of the people in this room had already decided I was the enemy. I raised my hand. Point of order. As an affected party, I'd like the opportunity to address these allegations before any vote is taken. Constance's smile tightened. This is a members-only meeting. Ms. Whitfield, you're not a resident of Copper Ridge Estates. I kept my voice calm. Arizona Revised Statute Section 33, Chapter 16, provides that any party whose property rights may be affected by HOA action has the right to address the board in open session. I'm requesting 2 minutes. Constance glanced at Warren, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Very well, 2 minutes. I walked to the front, connected my laptop to the projector, and turned to face the audience. 180 faces stared back, curious, hostile, confused, a few openly sympathetic. I had 2 minutes to change everything they thought they knew. My name is Nora Whitfield. My grandfather owned this land for 60 years before any of these houses existed. 3 weeks ago, I inherited his property, including something most of you have never been told about. I clicked to the first slide, a scan of the ground lease agreement, dated 1985. This is a 50-year ground lease between my family and the developer who built Copper Ridge Estates. It grants the right to build on Whitfield land in exchange for annual payments. The land itself was never sold. I clicked to the next slide, the survey map showing property boundaries. This is the official county survey. The red line marks Whitfield family land. Everything inside, every house, every street. This building sits on property my family still owns. The room erupted, people turning to each other, voices rising. That can't be right. We own our homes. I raised my voice above the noise. You own your structures. When you bought property here, you purchased what's called a leasehold interest. The disclosure was on page 47 of your contracts. The land operates on a separate lease that expires in 2035. 10 years from now, Constance stood abruptly. This is misinformation designed to cause panic. I clicked to the third slide, payment records. These are the annual lease payments the HOA has made to my family since 2005. $150,000 per year, drawn from your fees. In 20 years, this community has paid over $3 million for the right to exist on our land. I looked directly at Constance. Did the board ever disclose these payments to the membership? A man in the middle section stood up. I've been paying fees for 12 years. Nobody ever told me we were paying rent. A woman near the front turned to the board. Is this true? Have you been lying to us? Constance's composure was cracking. The lease arrangement is a legacy matter. It doesn't affect your ownership. It affects everything, the man was shouting now. You told us we owned our property. I clicked to the final slide, the list of documented violations. Section 4.2 prohibits construction beyond approved boundaries. This building was expanded twice without landowner notification. Section 8.3 prohibits commercial use. This space has been rented for private events, generating revenue never disclosed to the landowner or membership. These violations give me grounds to terminate the lease with 90 days' notice. The room went silent. I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here because you deserve the truth about the property you live on and the people managing it. Constance was pale, gripping the table edge. Warren had risen from his seat, expression caught between fury and fear. The audience had transformed, no longer unified behind their board, but fractured, questioning everything. Someone called out, "How do we know these documents are real?" I pulled certified copies from my folder. "County recorder's office. Anyone can verify them." Another voice, "Can she really terminate the lease?" I nodded. "The violations are documented, but termination isn't what I want. I want transparency, I want accountability, and I want residents to finally have a voice in decisions affecting their homes." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Constance attempted to call for order, but no one was listening. People crowded forward, demanding to see documents, asking questions. Warren grabbed Constance's arm and pulled her toward a side exit, their departure noticed by dozens of witnesses. Board members sat frozen, clearly unprepared for anything like this. I answered questions for nearly an hour until my voice grew hoarse and the crowd finally began to thin. Dolores found me in the parking lot as the sun was setting. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. After all these years, someone finally told them the truth. I leaned against my car, exhausted but strangely at peace. "This isn't over. Constance won't accept this quietly." Dolores nodded. "She'll fight. She always fights." She looked toward the community center, where a few residents still lingered in small groups. But now they know, and knowing changes everything. I drove home through streets that technically belonged to me, past houses full of families who'd just discovered their world was more complicated than they'd ever imagined. The first reveal was complete. But I knew Constance Blackwell well enough to understand she wouldn't surrender without a final, desperate attempt to save herself. The question was how far she'd go and whether I'd be ready when she made her move. The retaliation came faster than I'd expected. 48 hours after the community meeting, Dolores called to tell me the board had convened an emergency session closed to the public. No advance notice, no agenda distributed. Elena Martinez, her contact inside the subdivision, had learned about it from a neighbor who served on the architectural committee. The vote was 4-1 in favor of expediting legal review of lease validity. The lone dissent came from a board member named Patricia Okonkwo, who had apparently asked uncomfortable questions about why the lease had never been disclosed to residents. By the following morning, Patricia had been removed from the board for conduct unbecoming a community representative. Warren Blackwell filed a complaint with the county 3 days later. I learned about it when a process server appeared at my door with a summons the Copper Ridge Estates HOA was alleging fraudulent misrepresentation of property rights and seeking a declaratory judgment that the ground lease was invalid due to procedural defects in the original conveyance. The complaint was 47 pages of legal language that essentially argued my grandfather had never had the authority to lease land he'd owned for decades. It was nonsense. Chad confirmed as much within hours of reviewing it, but nonsense that would cost time and money to refute in court. The anonymous letter appeared in my mailbox that same evening. Plain white envelope, no return address, block letters cut from magazines like something out of a crime thriller. "Leave while you still can. This is your only warning." I photographed it, sealed it in a plastic bag, and called the county sheriff's department. Deputy Martinez, no relation to Elena, took my statement with professional detachment and promised to file a report, though he made clear that anonymous threats without specific evidence of the sender rarely led to arrests. I added the letter to my evidence folder and installed motion-activated cameras around the property that night. The fence was cut sometime after 2 in the morning. I woke to the alert on my phone, pulled up the camera feed, and watched a dark figure in a hoodie working along the eastern boundary with bolt cutters. The infrared footage was grainy, the face impossible to identify, but the deliberate nature of the damage was unmistakable. 3 sections of fencing, enough to create a gap wide enough for a vehicle to drive through. I called the sheriff again. Deputy Martinez returned, examined the damage, and noted that without clear identification of the perpetrator, there wasn't much he could do beyond documenting the incident. "Could be kids," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than I did. County code enforcement arrived the next afternoon, responding to an anonymous complaint about unsecured property creating hazards for adjacent residents. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Reeves, who clearly didn't want to be there, walked the perimeter, noted the damaged fence, and asked me how long it had been in that condition. I showed him the sheriff's report from 12 hours earlier. He made some notes, told me I had 30 days to repair the fence or face citations, and drove away without meeting my eyes. The complaint had been filed at 7:15 that morning, less than 5 hours after the fence was cut. Someone had known exactly when and where to report. I called Chad from my grandfather's study, surrounded by the documents that had started all of this. "They're trying to create a paper trail," he said. "Documented problems, official complaints, evidence that your property is the nuisance they've been claiming. If this goes to court, they'll argue you're the bad actor, not them." I asked him what we could do. "I'm sending a formal notice today. Section 11.2 of the lease prohibits the tenant from interfering with the landlord's peaceful enjoyment of adjacent property. Vandalism, threats, coordinated harassment, all of it constitutes breach. They have 30 days to cure or face termination proceedings." He paused. "I'm also filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. The failure to disclose lease terms to home buyers may constitute consumer fraud. That gets us an official investigation, which means subpoena power for financial records they've been hiding." Dolores came by that evening with tamales her daughter had made, and questions I'd been asking myself for days. We sat on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, the subdivision lights flickering on one by one in the valley below. "You could end this tomorrow," she said quietly. "Terminate the lease, take back the land, watch them scramble." I shook my head. 450 families, Dolores, 1,200 people who had nothing to do with what Constance and Warren have been doing. They bought homes in good faith, raised their kids there, built their lives. I'm not going to destroy all of that because of two corrupt people. She was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather would have done the same thing. He had the power to end this for 20 years. He never used it." I asked her why she thought he had waited. Maybe he was waiting for someone who'd use it right, someone who would hold the guilty accountable without punishing the innocent. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much injustice in her 72 years. "That's harder than just burning it all down. It takes patience and evidence and the right moment." The right moment was coming. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday, a mandatory gathering where board elections were held, budgets were approved, and community business was conducted in front of the entire membership. Unlike the emergency session I'd crashed, this meeting required public notice, open attendance, and formal procedures that even Constance couldn't manipulate. Chad was preparing a comprehensive presentation, financial records obtained through our AG complaint, documentation of every violation and act of retaliation, evidence of the Blackwell's property scheme that had driven out 12 families over the past 5 years. I spent the week repairing my fence, reviewing documents, and waiting. Constance had escalated from harassment to vandalism to legal warfare. She'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. And she still didn't understand that every desperate move she made was building the case that would destroy her. The annual meeting would be her last chance to control the narrative. By the time it was over, the entire community would know not just about the lease, but about everything she and Warren had done to abuse their positions. She wanted a final confrontation. She was about to get one. The annual meeting drew the largest attendance in Copper Ridge history. 220 residents filled the community center, with more standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Word had spread about the emergency session, about Patricia Okonkwo's removal, about the lawsuit Warren had filed. People wanted answers. Constance Blackwell stood at the podium looking polished and confident, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept scanning the crowd for threats. A county representative sat in the back row someone Chad had contacted through our Attorney General complaint, here to observe how the board handled questions about financial transparency. Constance moved through the agenda with forced efficiency, rushing past budget items and committee reports. When she called for board election nominations, I raised my hand. "Before we proceed, I'd like to request time to address the membership regarding matters of community interest." Constance's smile turned brittle. "Ms. Whitfield, we've already heard your presentation. The board is handling the legal matters through appropriate channels." A man near the front stood up. "I want to hear what she has to say. A lot of us do." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Constance glanced at the county representative, then at Warren, who shook his head slightly, but she was trapped. Refusing would only confirm she had something to hide. 5 minutes, she said through clenched teeth. I walked to the front and connected my laptop to the projector. 3 weeks ago, I showed you the ground lease that governs this community. Today, I'm going to show you what your board has been doing with your money. The first slide displayed financial records obtained through the AG investigation, a breakdown of HOA revenue and expenditures over the past decade. This community collects approximately $1.8 million annually in fees. $150,000 goes to ground lease payments. Around $400,000 covers legitimate maintenance and operations. I click to the next slide. The remaining $1.2 million has been flowing through accounts controlled by board members, paying contractors who don't exist, funding administrative expenses that no one can document. The third slide showed property records for Blackwell Properties, LLC. Over the past 5 years, 8 families in this community were subjected to harassment campaigns, citations, complaints, social pressure until they sold their homes below market value. Every single one of those properties was purchased by this company, registered to Warren and Constance Blackwell. I displayed the timeline citations beginning within weeks of each family refusing some board request, followed by escalating pressure, followed by sale. The Blackwells have been using their positions to drive out residents and acquire property. They have extracted hundreds of thousands of dollars in questionable fees, and they've hidden the existence of the ground lease to prevent anyone from asking how this community actually operates. Constance grabbed the microphone from its stand. These accusations are defamatory. I've dedicated 14 years to this community. Then explain the contractor payments, someone shouted. Explain why you never told us about the lease. Another voice. Where's the money, Constance? The room was turning against her, anger building like a wave. Warren rose and moved toward the exit, but the county representative stepped into his path. Mr. Blackwell, I'd recommend you stay. We have questions. Constance's composure completely shattered. You don't understand what I've done for this place when I took over. This was a mess. Unpaid bills, crumbling infrastructure, residents who didn't appreciate anything. I built this community, I made it what it is. She pointed at me, her voice rising to a shriek. And now this outsider comes in with her grandfather's papers and thinks she can destroy everything I've created. This is my community. These are my people. The silence that followed was devastating. 220 residents stared at their board president, finally seeing the person behind the polished facade, someone who believed she owned them. A woman I recognized as Elena Martinez stood slowly. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board leadership, pending a full independent audit. The motion was seconded before she finished speaking. The vote was 198 to 12. Constance stood frozen at the podium as the county representative approached with questions about financial disclosures. Warren was already being escorted toward the door by a deputy who'd arrived during the presentation. 14 years of control ended in 14 minutes. The legal consequences took 3 months to finalize. The state attorney general's investigation confirmed systematic fraud, falsified contractor invoices, unauthorized transfers, failure to disclose material information to homeowners. Constance was charged with fraud, theft by deception, and breach of fiduciary duty. Warren faced accessory charges plus vandalism and filing false reports. The evidence from my cameras and the threatening letter, which forensic analysis linked to a printer in the HOA office, added weight to the case. Constance received 3 years probation, $180,000 in restitution, and 200 hours of community service. She was permanently banned from serving in any HOA governance role in Arizona. Warren's sentence was lighter, 2 years probation and $50,000 in fines, but both were required to divest their improperly acquired properties. The 8 homes they'd purchased through harassment were sold at fair market value, with proceeds returned to the original owners or their heirs. The Hendersons used their settlement to buy a house in New Mexico, closer to their grandchildren. Mrs. Patterson's daughter received a check for the difference between what her mother had been paid and what the home was actually worth. The lease renegotiation took longer. Chad helped me draft terms that balance my family's interests with the community's need for stability. We agreed to a 25-year extension at the same annual rate, with provisions for full financial transparency, annual independent audits, and resident approval of any major expenditures. The homeowners voted 94% in favor. For the first time in 2 decades, they understood exactly what they were paying for and why. Dolores Vega was elected to the new board. along with Elena Martinez and Patricia Okonkwo, who'd been reinstated after Constance's removal. They reduced monthly fees by 20% once the fraudulent expenditures were eliminated. The community center was renamed at the residents' request, the Whitfield Community Center, a tribute to the family that had owned this land for 3 generations and chosen stewardship over exploitation. 6 months after the trial, I opened the gate that had separated my grandfather's property from the subdivision since it was built. We created a walking trail connecting the 2 parcels, a path through the desert where families could walk, jog, or simply watch the sunset over the mountains. On the dedication day, nearly 100 residents came to walk the trail. Children ran ahead while parents lingered, taking photographs, introducing themselves to neighbors they'd never spoken to when fear and suspicion had governed their community. I stood on the hill overlooking the subdivision. As the sun went down, 450 homes, 1,200 people, all on land my grandfather had held in trust for 60 years. He'd told me once that owning land wasn't about control. It was about responsibility, about protecting something for the people who would come after you, even if you never met them. I finally understood what he meant. Constance Blackwell had believed power meant making others afraid. She'd spent 14 years building a kingdom on lies and intimidation. But real power isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can protect. My grandfather knew that, Dolores knew it, and now, finally, so did I. The trail stretched out before me, connecting what had been divided, opening what had been closed. 1,200 people had a home tonight because someone chose accountability over vengeance, transparency over control. That was the inheritance Henry Whitfield had really left me. Not just land, not just leverage, but the chance to use both for something that mattered.